The prince hired a peasant girl to cook for him, but her smile fed his starving heart. Howls across the Bavarian mountains. A lonely prince hides in exile, his halls cold, his soul hungrier than his stomach. Then she arrives, a poor village girl with nothing but a basket of bread and a smile that warms the frozen air. But when her laughter begins to mend his broken spirit, whispers spread. Soldiers ride through the night. Chains rattle. The court demands he denounce her or lose his crown forever. She was only meant to cook his meals, yet now her very life hangs by a thread. Will he sacrifice love to save his throne or risk everything to stand by the one heart that truly feeds him? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The winter dawn broke cold and gray over the Bavarian forests, painting the hunting lodge in dim, misty light. Prince Ulrich's small party of guards and servants made their way up the winding path, their horses' hooves crunching on frozen ground. The prince himself rode at the front, his broad shoulders wrapped in a thick wool cloak, his expression as forbidding as the weather. The hunting lodge loomed before them, its stone walls dark with moisture, windows shuttered against the chill. Where once the royal standard had flown proudly, now only bare flagpoles stood sentinel. Alaric's jaw tightened at the sight. This wasn't a retreat, it was exile, no matter how his enemies at court chose to phrase it as they entered the courtyard. Only one figure emerged to greet them, the old groundskeeper, Hans Bauer, his weathered face creasing into a respectful bow. "Your Highness, welcome to Waldrew Lodge." Alaric dismounted, his boots landing heavily on the cobblestones. His gaze swept over the empty yard, noting the untrimmed hedges and scattered leaves. The place has seen better days, it seems. "Aye, Your Highness." Most of the staff were called. Back to the capital, 3 seasons passed. I've done what I could to maintain things, but Hans gestured helplessly at the vast building. Then the prince's retinue waited, uncertain, as Alaric strode to the main entrance. Inside, the great hall echoed with their footsteps. Bare walls showed lighter patches where tapestries had once hung, and a thin layer of dust coated the furniture. The prince's expression darkened further. "Your Highness," the captain of his guard ventured, "shall we begin setting up the household?" Alaric turned, his voice firm. "No, you will all return to the capital, save for one guard. I came here for solitude, not to recreate the very court politics I seek to escape." A murmur of protest rose from the servants, but Alaric silenced them with a raised hand. "I will not be swayed in this. Captain, choose one man to remain. The rest of you will depart before midday." The prince walked through the lodge's empty rooms as his retinue reluctantly prepared for their return journey. The kitchens stood cold and barren, copper pots hanging unused, the great hearth dark. In the dining hall, chairs sat stacked against walls, and the library shelves gaped with empty spaces where books had been removed. Hans followed at a respectful distance, watching as Alaric took in the lodge's diminished state. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "if I might make a suggestion." Alaric paused, turning to the old man. "Speak freely, Bauer. The lodge needs tending, cooking, cleaning, basic comforts. There's a lass in the village, good family, hard worker. She could help make things more ... livable." The prince's first instinct was to refuse. He had come here to escape people, their schemes, their false faces. But as another cold draft whistled through the hall, reality asserted itself. "You vouch for this girl's character?" "With my life, Your Highness. She's as honest as sunrise." Alaric paced before the main hall's fireplace, considering. The thought of trying to maintain the lodge alone was impractical, even with one guard and the groundskeeper. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. But she must understand this is a simple position, nothing more." I won't have court gossips spinning. Tales, of course, Your Highness. Hans bowed, relief evident in his voice. I'll go to the village at dusk and speak with her family. As the day wore on, Alaric's retinue departed, hooves clattering down the path toward the capital. Only one guard remained, taking up his post by the main entrance. The prince stood before the great hall's fireplace, watching flames leap among fresh-laid logs, but their warmth did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones. Evening shadows lengthened across the floor as Hans prepared to leave for the village. Alaric continued his restless pacing, the empty lodge pressing in around him. Each echo of his footsteps seemed to mock the solitude he had demanded. Now, in the growing darkness, that solitude felt less like freedom and more like a prison of his own making. The old groundskeeper's departure left Alaric alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire, the weight of his exile finally settling fully upon his shoulders. The lodge's silence spoke louder than any court whisper ever had. Dawn painted the snow-crusted forest in shades of pearl and gold. As Greta Mahler made her way up the winding path to Waldrew Lodge, her worn boots left deep prints in the fresh powder, and her patched woolen cloak billowed in the crisp morning air. In one hand, she carried a basket of hearty dark bread she had baked before sunrise. In the other, a well-seasoned iron pot swung gently with each step. The guard at the gate regarded her with stern suspicion until she explained her purpose. Master? Hans sent me. Sir, I'm to cook and clean for His Highness. Her voice was clear and steady, despite her nervousness at facing nobility. Inside the great hall, Prince Alaric stood before the dying embers of last night's fire, his back rigid with the formal posture of court training. As Greta entered, she attempted an awkward curtsy, nearly losing her grip on the breadbasket. Your Highness, I'm Greta Muller. The groundskeeper said you needed help with the lodge. Her direct manner and unpolished speech made Alaric's jaw tighten. This was what Hans had sent. Some village girl who didn't even know proper forms of address. That will be all, he began dismissively, but at that moment, his stomach betrayed him with an audible growl. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. Greta pretended not to notice his embarrassment. I've brought fresh bread, Your Highness, and I can have a proper soup ready within the hour if you'll show me to the kitchen. Alaric hesitated, pride warring with hunger. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Very well, you may begin your duties. The kitchens are through there. He gestured toward a dark doorway. Greta's face brightened with a smile that seemed to warm the entire hall. Thank you, Your Highness. You won't regret it. Without waiting for a response, she hurried toward the kitchen, her energy a stark contrast to the lodge's gloomy atmosphere. Soon, the smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. Greta had found some dried lentils in the pantry and combined them with wild herbs she'd gathered on her walk up. The simple ingredients transformed under her careful attention into something that made even Alaric drift closer to the kitchen, drawn by the homey scents. When she served the soup in one of the lodge's fine bowls, steam rising invitingly, Alaric was surprised by the depth of flavor. The broth was rich with garlic and thyme, the lentils perfectly tender, and the fresh bread provided a hearty accompaniment. This is quite acceptable, he admitted, which made Greta beam with pleasure as she moved about. Straightening the kitchen and beginning to tackle the lodge's dust, she spoke cheerfully of village life. Father Anselm says we're blessed with good neighbors, even in hard times. When Mama fell ill last winter, everyone helped with food and firewood. That's what community means, isn't it? Looking after each other. Alaric found himself listening despite his initial determination to maintain distance. Her simple faith in goodness was so different from the calculated moves of court life. And your father? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Gone to God 5 years past, Greta replied, her smile turning gentle. but Mama and I manage. The Lord provides, as Father Anselm always says. As evening settled over the lodge, Alaric sat at the massive oak table in the dining hall, finishing a second bowl of soup. Greta had found a pile of neglected linens and settled herself near the fireplace with needle and thread. Humming softly as she worked, the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, and their warm light caught the contentment in Greta's expression. As she mended, Alaric found his gaze drawn to her more often than he cared to admit. There was something soothing about her presence, not just her cooking or her cleaning, but the simple joy she brought to every task. He watched the firelight play across her smile, puzzled by the calm that seemed to settle over him in her presence. It was unlike anything he'd known at court, where every smile hid a scheme. Her happiness appeared as natural as breathing, and somehow its genuineness made the cold lodge feel a little more like home. A week had passed since Greta's arrival at Waldrew Lodge, and the rhythms of daily life had settled into comfortable patterns. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside the frost-glazed windows, while inside, warmth and quiet contentment filled the great hall. The kitchen fires burned steadily now, and savory aromas of herb-seasoned breeze. Stews often drifted through the corridors. Greta hummed softly as she kneaded dough at the heavy wooden table, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her apron. The familiar motions brought comfort, reminding her of mornings spent baking with her mother. In the adjoining hall, Prince Alaric sat in his favorite chair near the hearth, a leather-bound volume of philosophy open in his hands. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the pages. The peaceful scene shattered with the sudden pounding of hooves in the courtyard. Boots scraped on stone, and the great door burst open, letting in a blast of frigid air. The courier, Matthias Klein, stumbled in, his clothes crusted with ice and his face red from 3 days of hard riding through the winter storm. "Your Highness," he gasped, dropping to one knee. His hands shook as he withdrew a packet of letters, sealed with crimson wax, urgent dispatches from the capital. Alaric's expression hardened as he recognized the seal. He broke the wax with steady fingers, but Greta, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw how his shoulders tensed as he read. The prince's face grew paler with each line until finally he crumpled the parchment in his fist. "So," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it seems my stepmother grows impatient for my death." Greta's heart clenched at his words. She retreated to the kitchen to fetch wine for the exhausted courier, but stayed within earshot as Matthias accepted the cup with trembling hands. "The regent spreads poison with a silver tongue, Your Highness," the courier murmured, glancing nervously at the shadows. "At court, they whisper you're unfit to rule, too scholarly, too soft-hearted. There's talk of ... He lowered his voice. Further, ... a hunting accident. Soon, I heard soldiers may be sent north within the fortnight." Alaric stood abruptly, pacing before the fire. Of course, I wait for nature to take its course when a well-placed arrow could speed matters along. His bitter laugh held no humor. I should have seen this coming. The exile was just the first step. Greta could bear it no longer. Setting aside her bread dough, she stepped into the hall. "Your Highness," she said softly. Alaric turned, seeming surprised to find her there. The courier bowed hastily and withdrew, leaving them alone with the crackling fire. "What can you know of such matters?" Alaric asked. But the words held more weariness than scorn. "I know that even the poorest peasant can face hardship with dignity," Greta replied, her voice gentle but firm. "When the tax collectors took our cow last spring, Mama didn't curse or rage. She prayed for strength and worked harder at her spinning. We survived." "This is rather more serious than a lost cow," Alaric said dryly. "Perhaps, but the principle remains the same. Faith and courage see us through dark times." Greta's clear eyes met his without flinching. "God doesn't abandon his children," be they princes or peasants. Alaric studied her face in the firelight, finding no trace of the flattery or hidden motives he'd grown so weary of at court. How do you maintain such simple faith in a world so full of treachery? Because I've seen more kindness than treachery, she answered, and because bitterness is a poison that hurts only the one who harbors it. As night deepened over the lodge, Greta knelt beside her small cot in the servants' quarters, hands clasped in prayer. Lord, protect him, she whispered into the darkness. Give him strength to face what comes, and let him see he's not alone. Unknown to her, Alaric stood in the shadows of the corridor, having come to check that all was secure for the night. He watched her bent head, listened to her soft prayers, and felt something shift in his heart. All the elaborate protestations of loyalty he'd received at court had never moved him as deeply as this simple servant girl's honest concern. Her genuine goodness bound him more surely than any noble's calculated flattery ever had. The prince lingered a moment longer, then withdrew silently, leaving Greta to her prayers in the gentle darkness. Dawn crept over the snow-covered grounds of Waldrew Lodge, painting the frost-covered windows with pale golden light. Inside, the great hall stirred with gentle morning activity. The hearth fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls as Greta moved about the kitchen with practiced familiarity. The rich, comforting aroma of honey sweetened porridge wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh-baked bread. Prince Alaric descended the main staircase, drawn by the welcoming smells and warmth. Over the past weeks, he had grown accustomed to finding Greta already at work in these early hours, her quiet industry bringing life back to the once cold lodge. This morning, he carried something tucked beneath his arm, an old psalter bound in worn leather. "Good morrow, your highness," Greta called cheerfully, ladling porridge into an earthenware bowl. "I hope you slept well, better than I have in many months," he admitted, settling into his usual place at the table. He placed the psalter beside his bowl, catching Greta's curious glance at the book. "Can you read, Greta?" he asked gently. She shook her head, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "No, your highness. Though I've always wished I could read the Bible for myself, instead of only hearing it in church." Alaric opened the psalter, its pages illuminated with rich colors and gold. "Leaf, would you like to learn?" Greta's eyes widened with delight. "Truly, you would teach me." "Come," he said, gesturing to the bench beside him. "We can begin with morning prayers." Greta wiped her hands on her apron and sat down, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Alaric turned the book so she could see the carefully penned letters. Her finger traced beneath the words as he began to teach her the basic sounds. "In te Domini sperav," he read slowly. "In you, Lord, I have hoped." In te Domini. Greta carefully sounded out each syllable, her face scrunched in concentration. "Very good," Alaric encouraged, surprised by how her earnest efforts touched him. Here was someone seeking knowledge not for advantage or power, but for the pure joy of understanding. As the morning progressed, their lesson was punctuated by laughter as Greta wrestled with particularly challenging Latin pronunciations. "Misericordia," she attempted, the word tangling on her tongue. "Misericordia," Alaric corrected, fighting back a smile. "It means mercy." "Mercy indeed." Greta giggled. "I fear I'm murdering the holy language." Her laughter was infectious, and Alaric found himself chuckling to a sound he hadn't heard from his own lips in far too long. The simple joy of teaching, of sharing knowledge without agenda or ulterior motive, awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. Throughout the day, village folk began arriving at the lodge's kitchen door. They came quietly, bearing small gifts: fresh eggs nestled in straw, winter apples stored in root cellars, smoked fish wrapped in cloth. Each one greeted Greta warmly, speaking in hushed tones. "The prince seems different now," old Martha Weber whispered, pressing a jar of preserved plums into Greta's hands. Not so stern and frightening as they said. Folks say he's grown gentler since you came. He was never frightening, Greta protested softly. Only lonely and betrayed by those he should have trusted. As evening settled over the lodge, the windows glowed with warm firelight. Greta stood at the wash basin, her hands moving rhythmically through the soapy water as she cleaned the day's dishes. Without conscious thought, she began to sing an old hymn her mother had taught her, her clear voice rising and falling with a gentle melody. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. ... In his chair by the fire, Alaric closed his eyes, letting the simple beauty of her voice wash over him. The psalm they'd studied that morning echoed in his mind. In you, Lord, I have hoped. Here in this quiet moment, with the fire crackling and Greta's song filling the air, he felt a peace he had thought forever lost in the treacherous halls of court, the gentle domesticity of the scene, dishes clinking softly, water splashing. The hymn's sweet notes rising to the rafters wrapped around him like a warm blanket. For the first time since his exile began, Waldrew Lodge truly felt like home. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the winter sun casting long shadows across fresh snow. Church bells tolled in the distance, their deep bronze voices calling the faithful to worship. Inside Waldrew Lodge, Prince Alaric adjusted a plain wool cloak, one far beneath his usual station. We should attend services, he announced as Greta cleared away their breakfast bowls. Both of us, Greta paused, surprise evident on her face. Your Highness, are you certain? The villagers? ... We'll see a man seeking God's guidance, nothing more. His voice softened. Besides, I cannot hide forever in these walls while life continues beyond them. Greta nodded, hurrying to dan her best dress, a simple brown wool garment with careful mending at the seams. She wrapped herself in her warmest shawl, the same one she'd worn on her first day at the lodge. They walked the snowy path to the village church. Greta, a respectful step behind the prince. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their breath forming clouds in the cold. As they approached the small stone church, its windows glowing with candlelight, curious eyes turned their way. Villagers gathered in small clusters outside the church doors, their conversations falling to whispers as the unlikely pair passed. Greta kept her eyes modestly downcast, though she could hear the murmurs of approval at her humble demeanor. She's a good girl, that Muller lass, old Frau Weber whispered to her neighbor. See how proper she behaves, even with a prince. Inside, they sat near the back, the prince's hood pulled low. The familiar scents of beeswax candles and incense wrapped around them as Father Anselm began the service. Greta's clear voice joined the congregation's hymns, while Alaric found himself drawn into the simple beauty of worship without courtly ceremony. When they returned to the lodge, rosy-cheeked from the cold, Greta immediately set about preparing their Sunday feast. The kitchen soon filled with savory aromas as she worked. A plump hare, caught in the groundskeeper's snares, roasted slowly over the fire. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, and potatoes from villagers' winter stores simmered in herbs and broth. Alaric watched her work from his seat by the fire, struck by how naturally she moved through the space that had once felt so empty. Fresh bread, baked that morning before church, waited warm on the hearth. The simple abundance touched him more deeply than any elaborate court banquet ever had. When the meal was ready, Greta served it with her usual quiet grace. Alaric poured wine for them both, a rare gesture that made her cheeks flush. Too warm. Hearths and kind hearts, he said, raising his cup. His voice grew softer. Greta, I must confess, your presence here has made this exile bearable, more than bearable. You've brought life back to these cold walls. Greta's blush deepened, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. But the firelight caught the gentle curve of her smile, though, something warm and unnamed passed. Between them, in that quiet moment, the peaceful scene shattered at the sound of hoofbeats in the snow. A courier burst in, snow falling from his cloak, his face grave as he handed Alaric a sealed letter. "Your Highness," he gasped, still catching his breath. "Urgent news from the south." Alaric broke the seal, his face growing darker as he read. Greta stood frozen beside him, her hands clutched in her apron as she watched his expression change. "Soldiers," he said finally, his voice tight. "The regent sends troops northward. They ride for the lodge." Greta's face went pale, her earlier blush completely gone. Outside, the weather seemed to mirror their growing dread as snow began falling more heavily, thick flakes swirling past the windows. The warm intimacy of their shared meal evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the cold weight of approaching danger. Alaric's fingers tightened on the letter, crinkling the fine parchment. Usha. Beside him, Greta stood silent but steady, her presence both a comfort and a new source of worry. The storm outside grew stronger, turning the world beyond the windows into a swirling white void that matched the uncertainty now facing them both. The storm raged for 3 days, piling snow against the lodge's ancient walls. On the 4th morning, the thunder of hooves cut through the winter silence. 24 soldiers in the regent's colors burst through the gates, their horses' breath steaming in the bitter cold dot. Greta stood at the kitchen window, a bowl of dried herbs forgotten in her hands as she watched the courtyard fill with armed men. Her heart pounded against her ribs as the captain of the guard dismounted, his stern face visible even through the swirling snow. "Search the lodge." His voice boomed. "Across the yard, find the witch." Before Greta could move, the kitchen door crashed open. 2 soldiers seized her arms, their steel gauntlets biting through her worn dress. The bowl of herbs shattered on the floor as they dragged her outside into the biting cold. "Here's your sorceress, Captain," one soldier called, pushing her to her knees in the snow. "Found her in the kitchen, just as we were told." Captain Von Krantz approached, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He looked down at her with cold disdain. "So this is the creature who has bewitched our prince." A common kitchen wench, reaching far above her proper station. "Please, sir." Greta's voice shook, but she met his gaze. "I've done nothing wrong, only came to cook and clean," as the groundskeeper asked. Silence. The captain's hand struck her cheek. "We know your kind. Peasant girls with dreams of becoming princesses, using herbs and whispered spells to cloud noble minds." The commotion brought Prince Alaric running from his study. He burst into the courtyard, his face darkening with rage at the sight of Greta on her knees. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Every inch the royal heir, despite his simple clothing. Release her at once." The captain bowed, but his smile held no warmth. "Your Highness, I bear orders from the regent herself. This girl stands accused of witchcraft and seduction of a royal prince. She will be taken to the city for trial. This is madness." Alaric stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard. "She is innocent of any crime. I forbid this." Ah! The captain pulled a sealed document from his coat. "The regent anticipated your confusion, Your Highness. She offers you a choice. Denounce this peasant girl now, admit she clouded your judgment, and your claim to the throne remains secure. Defend her." He let the threat hang in the frosty air. Greta's heart clenched as she watched Alaric's face. She saw the war within. Him duty against conscience, birthright against justice. "Your Highness," she whispered, "do not throw away your future for my sake." The captain gestured, and soldiers brought forward heavy iron chains. They locked them around Greta's wrists, the metal so cold it burned. She bit back a cry as they pulled her to her feet. "This is your final chance, Your Highness," the captain said. "Denounce her, and all can be forgotten. Alaric stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. The soldier in him knew the tactical choice, but his heart rebelled at the cruelty before him. "I cannot," he said quietly. "I will not condemn an innocent soul to save myself." "Then the regent was right about your weakness." The captain turned away. "Take her to the carriage." Greta stumbled as they dragged her across the snow-filled courtyard. An enclosed carriage waited beyond the gates, its black paint stark against the white landscape. She tried to look back at Alaric one last time, but rough hands shoved her inside. The carriage door slammed shut with terrible finality. Through its small window, Greta watched Prince Alaric standing alone in the swirling snow, growing smaller as horses pulled her toward an uncertain fate. His posture spoke of helpless fury, of power stripped away by cruel politics. Just before the carriage turned onto the main road, she saw him lift his face to the gray sky. His lips moved, forming what looked like her name, not a farewell, but a promise. Then the trees closed in, and the lodge vanished from view, leaving only the sound of horses, hooves, and the rattle of chains to mark her journey toward judgment. The iron-bound carriage wheels jolted over another frozen rut, making Greta wince as her shoulders struck the hard wooden wall. 3 days of travel had left her weary and chilled to the bone. Her wrists, rubbed raw by the heavy chains, ached with every bump in the road. Through the small window, bare trees stretched their black branches against a steel-gray sky. Snow lay thick upon the ground, broken only by the carriage's tracks and occasional animal prints. The countryside passed in eerie silence, as if all of Bavaria held its breath. "Water," she croaked, her voice rough from disuse. The guard riding beside the driver ignored her plea, as he had done since their journey began. Instead, he called out, "Village ahead." Greta pressed closer to the window as they entered a small hamlet. Peasants stopped their work to stare at the official carriage, its black paint marking it as a bearer of the regent's justice. When they spotted Greta's face through the window, their expressions changed from curiosity to sorrow. An old woman, bent with age, made the sign of the cross as the carriage passed. Others followed suit, their gestures quick and furtive to avoid the guard's notice. A young mother pulled her children close, whispering what seemed to be a prayer. Their compassion brought tears to Greta's eyes. "Move along." The guard shouted at a group of villagers who had gathered too close. Nothing to see here. But there was much to see, Greta thought. They saw a simple girl in chains, accused of bewitching their prince. They saw the heavy hand of noble justice reaching down to crush one of their own. Most of all, they saw their own fears reflected in her fate. The danger of rising above one's station, of daring to touch the lives of the high-born Miles. Behind them, Prince Alaric drove his horse hard along the frozen roads. His mount's hooves struck sparks from stone as they galloped through the gathering dusk. Snow stung his face, and his fingers had long since gone numb inside his gloves, but he pressed on. Faster, he urged his horse, though the beast was already giving its all. We must reach them before the city. The horse's flanks heaved with effort as they thundered past startled travelers. Alaric knew he was risking both their lives, pushing so hard on treacherous winter roads. But the image of Greta in chains drove him forward like a lash. He had failed to protect her at the lodge. He would not fail her again. Back in the carriage, Greta closed her eyes against the growing darkness to keep her spirits from falling into despair. She recalled the peaceful evenings spent learning letters from Alaric's psalter, his patient voice guiding her finger across the page, teaching her to form the sacred words. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered now, the chains clinking softly as she shifted. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." ... Single quotes. The familiar verses brought comfort, even as the carriage rolled ever closer to judgment. She remembered how Alaric's eyes had softened when she first managed to read a full passage alone, how his smile had warmed her more than any fire. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Single quotes the guard rapped sharply on the carriage roof. Quiet in there. No spells. Greta fell silent, but kept the words alive in her heart as darkness settled over the land. Through the night they traveled, until finally, as dawn broke, the capital city rose before them. Its stone walls and towers loomed against the pale sky, magnificent and terrifying. The carriage clattered through the city gates and wound its way up steep streets toward the palace. Common folk stopped to stare at the prisoner being delivered to royal justice. Greta tried to hold her head high, though her heart trembled at the sight of the palace growing ever larger. When they finally stopped in the palace courtyard, the guards roughly pulled her from the carriage. Greta's legs, stiff from days of sitting, nearly gave way. The palace reared up before her, its windows like hundreds of watching eyes, its stones speaking of power and permanence, but far behind. Through the bitter night, Alaric drove his exhausted horse onward. The beast's breath came in great white clouds, its coat dark with sweat despite the cold. But still they rode, prince and mount, united in desperate purpose, racing against time and distance to reach the city before it was too late. "Hold on, Greta," Alaric whispered into the wind. "Hold on." Hundreds of candles flickered in ornate brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the marble walls of the great hall. The regent, Lady Sibylla, sat upon her carved wooden throne, her emerald silk gown gleaming in the warm light. Below her, arranged in tiered seats, dozens of richly dressed nobles watched the proceedings with barely concealed contempt. Greta stood alone in the center of the hall, her simple wool dress and apron stark against the splendor surrounding her. The chains binding her wrists clinked softly as she shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other. Dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights in the palace dungeons. So the regent's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "This is the kitchen wench who dared to enchant our beloved prince." Her lips curved in a cruel smile. "Look how she trembles before true nobility." Indeed, Greta's hands shook. But she lifted her chin and met the regent's gaze. "I have done nothing wrong, your grace. I served his highness as any loyal subject would." Laughter rippled through the hall, sharp and mocking. The regent raised one perfectly arched eyebrow. "Loyal? We shall see. Bring forth the witnesses." 3 villagers from near the hunting lodge shuffled forward, their fine new clothes marking them as recently rewarded. Greta recognized them, the miller's wife, a woodcutter, and the tavern keeper's son. They wouldn't meet her eyes. The miller's wife spoke first, her voice trembling. "I saw her gathering herbs in the forest at midnight, your grace. Strange herbs, not meant for cooking." "They were rosemary and thyme," Greta protested. For the prince's soup, silence. The captain of the guard struck the floor with his staff. "Speak only when addressed, peasant." The woodcutter stepped forward next. She smiled at him constantly, your grace. Bewitching smiles they were. No proper servant grins so at their master. More. Laughter filled the hall. Greta felt tears prick at her eyes, but refused to let them fall. The tavern keeper's son, red-faced and avoiding Greta's gaze, added, "I heard her singing foreign songs while she worked. Could have been spells, like as not." "They were hymns," Greta said softly. "Nothing more than church hymns." The regent leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Hymns. Yet here we have 3 honest citizens telling quite a different tale. What say you to their testimony?" Greta straightened her shoulders, though the chains weighed heavily. "I say only truth, your grace. I cooked his meals and kept his fires. I prayed for his health and happiness, as any Christian soul would." Do nothing more. The assembled nobles erupted in derisive laughter. Prayers from a peasant. Someone called out, as if heaven heeds such low petitions. The girl clearly aspires above her station. Another noble sneered, a common failing among the lowborn. The regent raised her hand for silence. Indeed, and such dangerous ambition must be. She paused meaningfully, corrected. Captain prepared to pronounce sentence. Suddenly, the great doors burst open with a thunderous crash. Wind and swirling snow gusted into the hall, causing the candles to flicker wildly. Prince Alaric stood in the doorway, his traveling cloak whipping around him, his boots and clothing stained from hard riding. "I demand audience." His voice rang through the suddenly silent chamber. "By my right, as heir to this duchy, I will be heard." The nobles drew back as he strode down the center of the hall, his face dark with fury. Snow melted in his hair and mud marked his path on the polished floor. But he carried himself with such authority that none dared speak against him. The regent's face tightened. "My dear stepson, you appear ... somewhat disordered. Surely any business can wait until you've made yourself more presentable. It cannot wait." Alaric continued forward until he reached Greta's side. Without hesitation, he placed his hand protectively over her chained ones. A collective gasp rose from the assembled nobles. The touch of his warm hand steadied Greta's trembling. She looked up into his face, seeing there the same quiet strength she'd known in their peaceful days at the lodge. Despite her chains, despite the hatred surrounding them, her heart filled with hope. The great hall fell silent as Prince Alaric turned to face the assembly, his hand still protectively covering Greta's bound ones. His voice, though weary from days of hard riding, rang with quiet authority. "My lords and ladies, you condemn this woman without knowing her true worth. While you feast in comfort, she has spent her days ensuring none in our village go hungry." The regent's lips curled. "Pretty words, but where is your proof?" As if in answer, the doors opened again. A group of villagers, led by Alaric's most trusted retainers, filed into the hall. Their clothes were humble but clean, their faces honest and determined. An elderly woman stepped forward, curtsying awkwardly. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but I must speak. When my grandchildren were sick this winter, it was Greta who brought U.S. soup and bread from the lodge kitchen. She never took payment, saying only that His Highness would want his people fed. She shared the prince's food with peasants." The regent's voice dripped with scorn. "That alone proves her theft." No, Alaric's voice cut through the murmurs. "It proves her understanding of true nobility. While you dine on gilt plates, my stepmother, she recognized that leadership means caring for all our people." He faced the assembled nobles. "If nobility lies in virtue, then she is nobler than all of us." A thin man in steward's garb pushed through the crowd, clutching a leather folio. "Your Highness, I can remain silent no longer." His hands trembled as he held out several documents. "These are records of the regent's dealings, proof of how she has extorted the poor, diverted tax money, and paid for false testimony." "Lady..." Sibylla rose, her face livid. "How dare you? The truth dares all things," the steward replied, gaining courage. "See here payments to today's witnesses, bribes to spread lies about His Highness's fitness to rule." The nobles crowded forward. Examining the papers, whispers grew to outraged murmurs as the evidence of corruption became clear. "Treason!" someone called out. "The regent has betrayed us all." The captain of the guard stepped forward, his face grave. "Your Grace, by the authority of the Duchy's council, you are ordered into immediate exile." As guards moved to escort the regent away, she turned one last venomous glare at Greta. "You may have one today, peasant, but you'll never truly belong in our world." The captain himself came forward to unlock Greta's chains. As they fell away, she burst into tears, not of fear or pain, but of overwhelming relief. Alaric gathered her hands in his touch gentle, despite his travel-roughened skin. "You are free," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Free and more worthy of respect than any who doubted you." Greta could only weep harder as the truth of her deliverance washed over her. While Alaric's thumbs traced soothing circles on her palms, the great hall blazed with the light of hundreds of candles, their flames reflecting off gilded frames and crystal goblets. Winter sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble floor where Prince Alaric stood tall before the assembled court. At his side, Greta wore a simple gown of cream silk, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "My lords, ladies, and good people of our duchy," Alaric's voice carried clear and strong through the hall. "Today I stand before you to announce my intention to wed." He turned to Greta, taking her hand in his. "Not for political alliance or wealth, but for love, the pure and noble love of this woman who taught me what true nobility means." Gasps and whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through leaves. Several older nobles turned away in disgust, while others watched with curiosity. From the back of the hall came sounds of joy as villagers, invited at Alaric's insistence, cheered their approval. The archbishop stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Your Highness, while unusual, there is precedent. And having witnessed Mistress Muller's character myself, ... double quotes, he smiled kindly at Greta. "I shall grant a special license with the banns waived by your princely authority." Greta's hands trembled in Alaric's. "I never dreamed of such joy," she whispered, her voice catching. "From that first day at the lodge, I only wished to serve with a true heart. And in doing so, you captured mine." Alaric replied softly. The ceremony proceeded with proper solemnity, though brightened by genuine warmth. Afterward, the great feast began, tables groaning with every delicacy the kitchens could provide. Yet when the first course arrived, Alaric raised his hand. "For we taste these fine dishes," he announced, "I have a special request." He nodded to a servant who brought forward 2 bowls of steaming broth, simple, fragrant with herbs and memories. "The first meal my bride ever prepared for me when I was a lonely exile. Nothing has ever tasted sweeter." Greta's eyes filled with tears as they shared the humble soup, remembering that cold day when love first began to warm their hearts. As evening drew near, the newlywed couple slipped away from the celebrating crowd. They stepped out onto the torchlit balcony, the winter night crisp and clear above them. Stars sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, blessing their union with heaven's own light. Hand in hand they stood, the prince and his peasant bride, their fingers intertwined as naturally as their hearts had joined. No crown or class could measure the wealth of their love. No social barrier could separate what God and true affection had brought together. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.